Hi, I'm Dr. Antonio Graceffo, and today we're going to be talking about the U.S.-China trade deal. Now, phase one of the deal has been signed, and I've already seen some criticism in the media and in the public. Oh, phase one doesn't seem to solve all the problems in U.S.-China trade. Well, yes, that's why it's called phase one. And the plan is to then have a phase two trade deal, which would address the rest of the issues. The problem I would like to identify, however, is that the difficulties, the problems, the conflicts in the U.S.-China trade dynamic are structural in nature. And for the U.S. to ever have free, fair, or reciprocal trade with China, China would have to make structural changes not only to their economy, but also to their system of governance. And I don't believe that they're prepared to do that. So, for example, one of the reasons why trade with China is unfair is because China has a system of state-owned enterprises, and it begins with state-owned banks making loans to state-owned companies which go overseas and secure minerals and raw materials and energy, and then they transport it back to China to be used in state-owned manufacturing concerns. And every step of the way, the companies are receiving government subsidies, they're receiving soft loans, they're getting preference on access to raw materials, to financing, and it makes the system very unfair because American companies and German companies and European companies are independently owned private companies that have to go on the market and compete for raw materials and compete for financing and compete for loans. And when they borrow money, they actually have to pay it back. Right now in China, public debt exceeds 300% of GDP. At banks, which are state-owned banks, the majority of the banks in China, if not all, are state-owned, and all the largest banks are state-owned, and they are directed to make loans to state-owned enterprises, government enterprises, and these enterprises generally or often do not repay their loans. So at the state-owned banks right now, we have what we call non-performing loans, which are loans that are either in default, in danger of default, late payments. And right now, non-performing loans are at an all-time high in Chinese banks. And many of the companies that owe this money are state-owned firms. In fact, the way the system is structured through the 5-year plans, through Xi Jinping thought, through the various directives that come from the CPC, the Communist Party of China, state-owned enterprises receive preference in receiving loans. So it actually makes it more difficult for non-state firms to even get loans. And then once the state-owned firms have the loans, of course, they will get these loans often without any sort of credit analysis, the ability or likelihood of them to repay it. They'll just get the loan, and then it's a soft loan, and they don't pay it back, and then it winds up being a non-performing asset on the bank's books. So straight away, for U.S. to compete with China on a fair and equal footing, China would have to do away with its system of state-owned banks. I don't know that they want to do that. They would have to do away with their strategic plans, their 5-year plans of ordering state-owned enterprises to do certain things. For example, they have the going out strategy, which is state-owned firms go abroad and buy up their competitors. And they do this with money provided by the government through state-owned banks. They have other strategies called grasping the big and releasing the small, which means the state-owned companies buy up all the smaller state-owned companies, and they get bigger and bigger. And then they go out and they buy up foreign competitors, and then they become what's called a national champion. And they have a strategy for creating national champions. And these are companies that are state-owned, or often state-owned, not always state-owned, which become the largest companies in their sector in the world. So IBC Bank in China is one of the biggest banks in the world. It's one of the biggest companies in the world. And this is all done through government directives, government plans, and government financing. And of course, as a state-owned enterprise, they're not required necessarily to turn a profit, which is one of the reasons why it's very difficult for a private company to compete with a state-owned company, because just if you think that the average corporate profit is 8%, and we can argue what the average corporate profit is, but let's just say that it's 8%. Well, that would mean that a company that doesn't have to produce a profit, doesn't have to generate a profit, can sell their goods 8% cheaper. right? So having independently owned enterprises, privately owned enterprises competing with government firms is unfair. And having the CPC, having the Communist Party establish directives, establish plans, and these things are published. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a cabal. This is not some grainy WikiLeaks something. I mean, these are in the 5-year plans. You just read every 5 years. China generates, they publish the 5-year plan, lets you know what their goal is. And these are some of the goals that they want to have. They want to buy up all their competitors abroad, make their companies the biggest. They're also on missions to do things like secure energy, minerals, food, farmland, all over the world, including the US, including Australia. At one point, I believe China was in danger of owning something like 2% of the total farmland in Australia. They're buying up farmland. In the United States, they acquired one of the largest pork producers, and they now own 25% of all the pork production in the United States. Obviously, foreign companies would not be allowed to do this in China, and yet we allow Chinese companies do that in our country, in the United States, but also in Australia, also in Canada. The same thing is happening. So the phase 2 trade deal, basically to bring trade, and I'm not as concerned with balanced trade as a lot of economists are. I'm very concerned with free, fair, and reciprocal trade. Meaning if you come to the US and buy a farm, I should be allowed to go to China and buy a farm. If you come to the US and open a bank, I should be allowed to go to China and open a bank. And for that to happen, and to stop the government subsidies, and to stop these companies from carrying out these massive government plans, would take a complete restructuring of their economy and their government. I almost don't think that within the market socialist model, the communist model that China applies, I don't think it would be possible to even make the reforms necessary without reforming everything across the government. So where does that leave us? I don't know. It means I can't imagine that phase 2 is going to bring things in line. It might be that phase 2 is going to, that those negotiations will break down and fail. And that will be the signal to the world that, hey, we tried to negotiate a fair deal with China. It's impossible to get a fair deal with China. And maybe the United States and all the other countries, all the free countries, will have to take steps appropriately. We'll have to accept that you will never have fair and free reciprocal trade with China. Okay, I'm Dr. Antonio Graceffo, as always, coming to you from Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. And I'd like to remind you that you can get my books on Amazon.com if you're interested in the Chinese economy. And you can follow me on Twitter. I'm the Brooklyn Monk on Twitter. And I tweet a lot about the Chinese economy, also the Mongolian economy, and also about wrestling and 1980s pop music and movies. And if you're not as interested in those things, that's fine. But as I work as an economist doing research and lecturing all day, I like to take some mental breaks and with my wrestling and my 80s pop references. Okay, thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Dr. Antonio Graceffo. Until next time, take care.